Have you ever walked past a place that felt wrong, where the silence pressed too heavy and the shadows seemed to lean closer with every step? Some buildings don't just hold history. They keep it breathing, buried beneath stone and soil, waiting for the living to stumble too near. Tonight, we step into such a place whispered about, avoided, yet never abandoned. A place where the ground does not rest, and neither do the dead. Stay close, because once you hear the toll of its bells, you might realize the grave it calls for was dug long ago for you. The town lay quiet beneath a heavy sky, a place forgotten by maps and ignored by passing travelers. At its edge stood the church, a gray husk of stone crouched against the horizon, its spire leaning as if burdened by centuries of whispered sins. Ivy clung to its walls like a suffocating hand, and the cemetery that surrounded it spread out in crooked rows, the earth swollen and uneven as though it never settled. Locals crossed themselves when they walked by, even in daylight, muttering under their breath as though the very air might overhear. It wasn't just the graves that unnerved them. It was the church itself. The way its shadow seemed to stretch further than it should, the way the wind grew still whenever one stood too close. At night no one dared. Windows were latched, curtains drawn, and lamps burned long past midnight, for the people here believed the church had never stopped its work, even long after the priests had abandoned it. It keeps the dead too close to the living. An old woman once told a passerby, her eyes darting toward the hill where the spire pierced the dark sky, and sometimes it forgets who belongs to which side. She spoke the words with a trembling lip before shutting her door, as though even repeating the tale might summon something from the ground. Those who listened long enough claimed to hear strange things. Bells that tolled without hands, echoes of hymns sung by no congregation, the scraping of nails against wood beneath the earth. But no one ever went close enough to confirm, and so the church remained, watching the town with hollow windows like sockets, its doors sagging but waiting, always waiting. It stood there, not merely a ruin, but a presence patient and hungry. The road into town was narrow, little more than a ribbon of cracked asphalt swallowed by weeds, and it wound its way toward the church like a vein leading to a heart. That was the road the outsider took, a stranger with a notebook and a recorder, someone who believed history was worth chasing even when it bled. They had heard the whispers of this place buried in old archives, mentions of funerals conducted in haste, of coffins sealed before breath had ceased, of the church whose bell seemed to toll at odd hours long after its congregation had vanished. To most, they were fragments of superstition. To the stranger, they were an invitation. The town itself was unwelcoming, as though it had grown tired of explaining its silence to outsiders. A few heads turned when the visitor passed through the square, faces etched with suspicion, some with pity. A man at the inn wiped his hands on a rag and asked, "You here for the church?" The words were spoken low, as if they might carry. When the stranger nodded, the man only shook his head. Some stories are meant to stay buried. You do well to leave them that way. But curiosity was already gnawing at the visitor's resolve. In the distance, the church loomed against the gray sky, its spire a crooked finger pointing at something unseen. Even from afar, it seemed to watch, to lean closer, as though it knew someone had come seeking its secrets. The historian felt a strange tightness in their chest, not fear exactly, but something older, something like recognition. The air itself seemed to whisper as they walked, carrying fragments of hymns too faint to catch. Each step forward felt less like a choice and more like obedience to something calling from the hill. They spoke of it only in fragments, never in full, as if saying too much might rouse something from the soil. In the dim light of the tavern, with shutters drawn tight against the evening, the stories came in whispers over the rim of all mugs. One man swore he had heard the bells toll at midnight, though the rope hung still, no hand upon it. Another woman, her eyes hollow with age, said she had passed by the graveyard after a storm and seen fresh earth churned, as if something inside had clawed upward, only for the mound to settle again by morning. A boy, no older than 10, whispered that his grandfather once pressed his ear to the church floor and heard voices beneath, pleading, crying, then suddenly silenced. His mother shushed him, her hand trembling as she pulled him close, muttering a prayer under her breath. The stranger listened, heart racing, though they kept their expression calm, pencil scratching across a worn page of their notebook. Every tale felt absurd, yet the conviction in the voices left no room for mockery. These people weren't sharing legends, they were confessing fears. "What happens if someone enters?" the stranger asked quietly. For a long moment, no one answered. Then the innkeeper leaned close, his voice low and sharp. "They don't come back the same. If they come back at all." His eyes darted toward the window, toward the hill where the church loomed even now, half hidden by trees but never fully out of sight. The room fell silent after that, and the visitor felt it, a heavy weight pressing against the air, a warning that this was no place for questions. Yet beneath the silence, their curiosity only deepened, like a moth drawn toward the flame, even knowing it might burn. The church was different in daylight, though no less unsettling. Its doors groaned open under the stranger's hand, a long, reluctant sigh of wood and iron. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and old smoke, yet beneath it lingered something sharper, faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Dust coated the pews in uneven layers, as if years had passed without a soul kneeling there. But when the stranger's fingers brushed the altar, they came away sticky with wax that had not yet hardened. Someone had been here recently. Someone had prayed in this place the town swore was abandoned. The stranger's eyes moved to the pulpit. An old hymnal rested open, its pages yellowed and brittle, yet one was marked fresh with a crease. The words stared back in bold, black print: "Awake, O sleeper." A shiver ran through them, though no breeze touched their skin. "Hello," the visitor called, their voice small against the cavernous silence. The sound seemed swallowed by the walls, muffled as though the church itself refused to carry it. For a moment there was nothing, then a faint creak above, like footsteps shifting on the gallery. The stranger tilted their head, staring up into the shadows, but the balcony was empty, only cobwebs swaying in still air. They exhaled, forcing a laugh to steady themselves. "Old wood," they muttered, though the unease clung stubbornly. Kneeling to inspect the wax drippings, the stranger noticed something else. A thin line of soil trailing along the floorboards, leading from the altar to the side wall, vanishing beneath a warped section of wood. They froze, heart hammering, for the soil was fresh, damp, the kind turned only by a recent burial. And from deep beneath the floor, faint as breath, something tapped once, twice, then fell silent. The graveyard keeper was waiting outside when the stranger finally stepped back into the daylight. He was thin, bent with age, his coat hanging loose from his frame like skin on bone. His eyes, pale and filmed over, fixed on the visitor with something that was not quite hostility, not quite pity, but something colder, as though he were measuring their worth. He carried a spade over his shoulder, its blade worn down and rusted from years of digging. "You shouldn't linger there," he said, his voice gravelly, the words rasping like stones dragged over each other. The stranger hesitated, then offered a polite smile. "I'm just here to study. I've heard stories about this church, about burials." The old man spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "Stories don't do it justice. That place doesn't wait for the dead. It takes the living." He leaned closer, the sour smell of earth and damp cloth rising from him. "And once it's taken notice of you, it never forgets. The church remembers every soul that steps through its doors." The words lodged in the stranger's chest like a hook. "What do you mean by that?" they asked, their voice dropping. The sexton's thin lips curled into something between a grimace and a smile. "Means you've already stayed too long. You've let it see you." For a moment, the visitor thought the man might laugh, but instead he lowered his gaze, tightening his grip on the spade. "Leave before nightfall. Don't think you can outrun it once the dark comes. You'll hear it calling, and God help you if you answer." The warning lingered as the old man turned away, his figure shrinking among the crooked graves, leaving only silence and the slow toll of dread in the stranger's heart. That night, the dreams came sharp and suffocating. The stranger found themselves pressed into darkness, wood scraping against their skin, the air thin and rotting with the stench of soil. They clawed at the coffin lid above, nails tearing, throat straining with screams that made no sound. The earth pressed down on every breath until their chest burned, until their heartbeat pounded louder than thought. Just when they thought they would black out, something shifted beside them in the coffin, a hand clammy and cold, brushing their arm in the dark. They woke with a violent gasp, sitting upright in the inn's narrow bed, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, save for the frantic rasp of their own breathing. They lifted their hands to their face and froze. Dirt packed into the creases of their nails, dark beneath the cuticles, as though they had been clawing through earth in their sleep. The stranger staggered to the wash basin, scrubbing until their fingers were raw. But no amount of water made them clean. Each time they blinked, they saw the coffin again, the feel of the lid closing, the sound of muffled sobs echoing in their skull. They pressed their palms against the edge of the sink, forcing themselves to breathe. From the corner of the room came a noise, soft, steady, impossible. Tap, tap. They turned slowly, dread hollowing their chest. The wardrobe door stood shut, yet the sound came from within, measured and deliberate, like fingernails rapping wood. The stranger whispered, "No." As the tapping ceased, leaving the silence heavier than before, they stood frozen for long minutes, waiting, listening, but nothing else came. Only the faint scent of soil rising in the stillness, as if the grave itself had followed them into their room. The stranger told themselves it was foolish, but as night fell again, they found their feet carrying them back to the church. The town lay silent behind them, its lamps shuttered, its streets deserted, as though every soul had retreated to wait out the darkness. The church rose like a shadow at the edge of the hill, its spire etched against a moonless sky. The air grew colder with every step, so cold that their breath came in quick, white puffs that hung too long in the stillness. They slipped inside, the heavy doors closing with a groan that echoed like a warning. The moment the latch fell, the silence pressed down hard, smothering. Their lantern's glow stretched only a few feet, the rest of the church swallowed in thick, patient dark. Yet the longer they stood, the more the space seemed to tighten. The pews felt closer together than they had before, narrowing the aisle as though the church itself were leaning in. Then came the sound, metal on stone. At first faint, then clearer, a rhythmic scrape. A shovel biting earth. The stranger held the lantern higher, its trembling light casting twisted shadows along the floorboards. The sound didn't come from outside. It came from beneath. They crouched, pressing an ear to the wood. The scraping grew sharper, joined by the muffled groan of straining breath, as if someone labored desperately below their feet. The boards vibrated faintly, dust trembling loose from the seams. Heart pounding, the stranger jerked upright, stumbling backward. The light wavered wildly, throwing flickering shapes across the altar. In that wavering glow, they thought they saw movement in the shadows beyond the pulpit. Something shifting just out of sight, waiting as the sound of digging echoed on, steady and deliberate, like a grave being prepared. The lantern's glow quivered as the stranger approached the altar, each step reluctant, their boots stirring dust that hadn't been touched in years. The sound of shovels gnawing at earth still echoed faintly below, but it seemed to fade into silence as they knelt, brushing their hands across the stone floor. Their fingers found a groove, a seam where the altar met the foundation, and with trembling effort they pried at it. The stone shifted, groaned, then slid enough to reveal a narrow stairwell spiraling downward into blackness. A rush of air rose from the opening, damp and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of soil and rot. They hesitated, but curiosity, sharper than fear, drove them on. Step by step, the light swallowed them as the stairs twisted deeper into the earth. The walls wept moisture, and faint scratches marred the stone, as though fingernails had dragged along in desperate ascent. At the bottom lay a small chamber, lined with shelves of decaying books and ledgers. The stranger set the lantern down, its light trembling across the pages. The records were meticulous, names written in careful script, dates of funerals, family histories. But the deeper they read, the stranger the entries became. Many bore no death date, only a name and the word taken written beside it. Whole families appeared in the lists, one after another, generations swallowed into silence. The stranger's breath caught when they turned to the final page. The ink was fresher, the handwriting hurried. There, beneath the last entry, was their own name, the letters still wet, smearing faintly beneath their fingertip. The lantern flickered violently, shadows jittering across the chamber walls. From above, the faint scrape of shovels resumed, steady and patient, as though the earth itself had been waiting for them to arrive. The chamber narrowed into a low corridor, the ceiling arched and sweating, the walls lined with niches carved into the stone. The stranger lifted the lantern, its weak glow stretching ahead, and their stomach turned. Coffins rested in those alcoves, stacked upon one another, their wood dark and swollen with damp. The closer they looked, the more detail revealed itself. Splintered edges, gouges across the lids, jagged as if torn by fingernails from the inside. Their pulse thundered as they stepped forward, lantern trembling in their hand. One coffin sat askew, its lid half shattered, the hinges snapped. Within lay a body collapsed against the wood, its hands curled into claws, its mouth frozen in a scream that had never been heard. The eyes were gone, but the terror lingered in the contorted face, so vivid that the stranger staggered back. Another coffin revealed worse. Only scraps of clothing remained, but the inside was clawed to splinters, and the lid bore the deep indent of fists pounding upward. They lifted the lantern higher, desperate not to see yet unable to look away. Some coffins were empty, their lids thrown aside, the stone beneath them smeared with the dark, faded trail of something dragged into the shadows. The air grew colder the deeper they moved, each breath a struggle against the damp, metallic stench of decay. A faint sound reached them then, softer than breath, yet unmistakable. A groan, weak and muffled. Their head whipped toward the far alcove, where a coffin shuddered once, then went still. The stranger froze, throat dry, every instinct screaming to flee. Yet their feet carried them closer, closer to the box that trembled faintly in the lantern's glow. Their hand reached for the lid before their mind could stop it. From within came a single, broken gasp. Someone, or something, was still alive inside. The stranger stumbled back from the trembling coffin, heart hammering, lantern light jerking wildly across the walls. Then the church itself seemed to stir. The ground beneath their feet quivered, the air shifting with a low groan that rolled through the stones. Dust rained down from the ceiling, as if the entire foundation had exhaled. Above the great bell tolled once, a deafening boom that reverberated through the earth, though no hand pulled its rope. The corridor shuddered. Boards overhead creaked and split, and from the cracks in the floor seeped a sound that clawed at the stranger's sanity. Hands. Fingers pressing up through splintering wood, stretching, grasping, the nails blackened, the skin torn. Some were skeletal, brittle as bone dust. Others were pale and damp, flesh still clinging, veins still pulsing faintly with stolen life. They scrabbled against the floorboards, pushing, reaching, demanding release. The stranger spun toward the stairwell, but the passage they had come through was gone, sealed in darkness, the walls pressing closer. The lantern flickered, shadows thickening, taking shape. Long figures shifting at the edges of sight, swaying like mourners in a funeral procession. A whisper slithered through the air, not one voice but many layered atop each other in a dreadful chorus, "Stay, stay." The pews above groaned as if weight pressed upon them, unseen bodies settling into their seats. The bell tolled again, louder, shaking the walls, a sound not of ceremony but of summoning. The stranger clutched the lantern tighter, but the flame sputtered, struggling for air as the church seemed to draw breath itself. The hands broke through at last, shattering the boards. Soil poured into the chamber, spilling like a tide, carrying with it the smell of fresh graves. The stranger staggered back, trapped, as the dead and the living alike clawed their way toward freedom. The lantern faltered, throwing jagged bursts of light across the chamber as the first of them pulled free from the earth. A body rose from the shattered boards, soil spilling from its mouth and eyes, yet its chest still lifted with shallow, rattling breaths. Another followed, pale as wax, its skin stretched thin, its lips moving as if whispering a prayer too faint to hear. Then more, an endless procession, some rotted to the bone, others horrifyingly alive, their faces slack with exhaustion, but their limbs still twitching, obeying some silent command. The stranger pressed back against the stone wall, choking on the sour stench of death and damp earth. The figures did not rush, did not lunge. They simply moved together, a slow and measured march, forming a line as though rehearsed for centuries. Their heads turned in unison toward the altar above, their movements not their own, guided by something deeper, something that pulsed within the walls of the church itself. One of them stepped closer, its eyes half closed, its lips torn as if from screaming against wood. It reached out with trembling fingers toward the stranger's chest, not in violence but in ceremony, as though preparing them for a rite. Behind it, another dragged chains that clinked against the stone, the sound echoing like a tolling bell. The stranger's breath hitched. "What do you want from me?" Their voice cracked in the silence. 100 voices answered at once, rising from the procession in a single hollow murmur. "To lay you down." The march closed in, the line of the dead and the barely living surrounding them, hemming them in like pallbearers gathering around a coffin. The stranger realized with cold certainty that the ceremony was already underway, and they were the offering. From the darkened aisle, a figure emerged, stooped but steady, the lantern's weak flame catching the edges of his weathered face. The old gravekeeper stood there, the same spade balanced across his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with a hollow calm. The stranger's heart lurched with desperate hope, but the feeling curdled the moment the man smiled. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a grim acknowledgement, like a priest welcoming a penitent into confession. "You've come far enough," he rasped, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous space. "The church has seen you. It has weighed you." The stranger shook their head, voice breaking. "Why? Why me?" The gravekeeper's expression hardened, the spade scraping as he lowered it to the floor. "Because it must always feed. You think this town survives by chance? No, it survives because the church chooses, and we obey." He stepped closer, his boots crunching across loose soil scattered from the graves above. "Your name was written before you set foot on our road. The book remembers. The church remembers. It always will." The stranger staggered back, their chest tightening, breath coming fast. You knew. You all knew." The old man's eyes softened with something like regret, but it never reached his voice. "Better you than us. That is the way of it." Behind him, the procession of figures halted, silent and waiting, as if he had given a signal only they could hear. The gravekeeper's whisper curled like smoke through the dark. "Lie down and let it take you. Struggle only makes it worse." The stranger's scream caught in their throat as hands, cold, strong, unyielding, seized them from every side, pulling them toward the open coffin at the altar's base, where the final rite awaited. The stranger thrashed, but every movement only drew more hands from the shadows. Some were cold as stone, skeletal fingers scraping skin, others were clammy, too alive, their nails digging deep as they dragged the struggling body toward the waiting coffin. The altar loomed above, candles bursting to life one by one, flaring high and violent as if rejoicing. Their flames bent inward, forming a crown of fire over the open box, casting wild shadows that read like mourners swaying in grief. "No, let me go," the stranger cried, their voice raw, but the church devoured the sound, swallowing it whole. The figures surrounding them did not blink, did not falter, their hollow eyes fixed on the ritual as though they had performed it countless times before. The coffin yawned open, its interior lined not with fabric but with soil dark and damp, reeking of decay. The stranger clawed at the ground, fingernails tearing, boots scraping against stone, but there was no escape. With every frantic cry, the hands only grew stronger, pulling them closer until their back pressed against the earth inside the box. The gravekeeper's face appeared above, his shadow stretching long and sharp across the stranger's chest. He raised the spade like a priest might lift a cross, his words quiet, reverent. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Taken, as all must be." The lid swung downward with a thunderous slam, plunging the world into suffocating blackness. Soil sifted through the cracks, falling across their face, their lips, filling their mouth with the taste of iron and rot. The stranger's screams echoed once, twice, then muffled, fading into silence as the earth claimed them. Above, the bell tolled again, triumphant and final, ringing out over a town that already knew. Morning broke pale and thin, the sun a weak coin struggling through a sky the color of ash. The townsfolk went about their routines as they always did, slow and deliberate, their faces unreadable, their silence deeper than the still air. At the edge of the hill, the church stood quiet, its crooked spire cutting the horizon like a wound. To anyone passing, it looked as it always had, abandoned, forgotten, a ruin too stubborn to fall. Yet the ground around it told another story. Fresh soil mounded at the edge of the cemetery, darker than the rest, damp from a night's labor. A few small belongings protruded from the dirt, half buried. A notebook corner torn and bent, a cracked fountain pen, a lantern handle slick with mud. No name marked the grave, only a simple wooden cross driven hastily into the earth. It leaned slightly, as if ashamed to stand straight. A child wandered near, barefoot in the grass, chasing a crow that pecked at the ground. His laughter faltered when he noticed the mound. He crouched low, brushing away soil with curious fingers until they struck something hard. A sleeve. He jerked back, eyes wide, then ran, calling for his mother. When she saw, she said nothing. She pulled him close, turning him away, whispering a prayer under her breath. Together they walked back toward the town, her steps quickening, her face tight with a fear she would not name. By midday, the mound looked undisturbed again. The earth had settled, as if it had always been that way. The crow returned, perching on the crooked cross, its black eyes gleaming in the sunlight. It cawed once, sharp and hollow, a sound that carried down the hill to the town below, and no one dared look up. Days later, A farmer passing through the square found a journal wedged between the boards of the tavern porch. Its leather cover was torn, damp with soil, the pages inside warped from moisture. He carried it in with curiosity, laying it on the counter where a few townsfolk gathered. None wished to touch it, though all leaned in close, drawn despite themselves. The first entries were neat, filled with careful notes about the church, its history, the locals' warnings. But as the pages turned, the writing grew frantic. Sentences broke apart. Ink smeared as though written in the dark. Words clawed across the paper by a trembling hand. The walls breathe, the floor moves under me. The earth is not still, they are not dead. One page was stained with a thick, reddish smear, as though the writer's hand had pressed hard while bleeding. The final entry stopped them cold. It ended mid-sentence, the words scratched deep into the paper. I can hear them, they are still breathing under the earth. The innkeeper closed the journal quickly, his hand shaking, and shoved it aside. The silence that followed was heavier than any bell toll. At last an old woman muttered, "Another taken." Her voice carried no surprise, only wary resignation. The others nodded, their faces grim but unchanged. No one spoke of searching, no one spoke of resistance. They simply returned to their tasks, as though the church's hunger was a storm they could not stop, only endure. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting the spire in shadow once more. A faint toll rang out across the fields, though no one looked toward the hill. They knew. The church had claimed another name, and the town would go on pretending it had never been different. And so the earth closed over another secret, the church standing silent, as it had for centuries, its stones heavy with the weight of the forgotten. The town carried on, whispering prayers they knew would never be answered, for the church listened only to the living it claimed. Yet sometimes, on windless nights, if you press your ear to the ground near its walls, you'll hear it. The muffled cries, the frantic scratching, the desperate proof that not all the buried are dead. The question is, when the church calls again, will it be your name written in its book?